Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this presentation. We're honored to have Mr. John Tamny as our featured speaker at this event. John is the political economy editor at Forbes, a senior economic advisor to Toreador Research and Trading, and editor of RealClearMarkets.com. A spinoff of the policy website Real Clear Politics, RCM seeks to compile top quality information and opinion about the stock markets and global economy. John frequently writes about the securities markets along with tax, trade, and monetary policy issues that impact those markets for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, Financial Times, National Review, and London's Daily Telegraph. His upcoming book, scheduled for release in April, is titled Popular Economics: What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics. He is a weekly guest on Forbes on Fox. The title of his talk today is Why Washington and Wall Street Are Better Off Living Apart. It's a big honor to present to you John Tamny.
Well, let me begin by saying how excited I am to be here today. It is a big deal to be speaking at the Future of Freedom Foundation, mainly because I love your uncompromising mission. It's so easy, and I think this is one of the negatives of a prosperous society, is that we sometimes forget why we are so prosperous. And we are because we were created long ago by people who elevated individual liberty and economic freedom above everything else. Usually when I speak, sometimes I speak in foreign countries, and to kind of wake people up when I get started, I lead with the U.S. is the best country in the world, bar none. And they give me this dirty look and think that's kind of rude. But what I always say is, well, the reason we are is because we've attracted the best and brightest from around the world to the United States. And the reason we are is the reason that the Future of Freedom Foundation is so important, is that you guys educate people around the country about the importance of what created this great nation. And you're also, of course, teaching them about the backsliding that's taken place over the last 115 years and how important it is to reverse this. So thank you for your uncompromising mission and what you do. I very much support it and hope to add to it with my commentary today. And so about all this, I want to first off thank Bumper Hornberger for inviting me out. I feel like I know you after all these years, thanks to our great friend Hall McAdams. He's talked about you forever and extolled your virtues, so it's great to finally actually get to meet you. Thanks to Bart Schaefer for all the work you did in putting this on. Thanks to Matt for taping me today. That's much appreciated. And Jim Bovard, I'm surrounded by these famous people. It's great to know you too. I've been reading you for years, so it's flattering that you're here today. Now, the title of my talk is, as you know, Why Washington and Wall Street Are Better Off Living Apart. And I think it's an apt discussion given the times in which we live, because I think this goes far, this relationship, in explaining why the economy struggles in a relative sense. And so I'm going to begin it with a brief quote, and it goes like this. Your number one client is the government. Those words were uttered by John Mack, the former CEO of Morgan Stanley, to James Gorman, the present CEO of Morgan Stanley, back in 2013. And they in many ways tell us everything we need to know about a relationship between Wall Street. And when I describe Wall Street, I'm talking about the broad financial sector and government that has grown way too close. And I say they also go very far in explaining exactly why both finance and government are viewed in such a negative light at present. Now, the tight relationship between the two is, contrary to what you hear, very much weakening Wall Street. It's popular in the media to talk about those fat cats in finance making off big thanks to their relationship with politicians, but really it's the opposite of that. And with Wall Street weaker, the economy is by definition weaker, and in a vicious circle of sorts, that is discrediting the political class that is too close to finance in the first place. And so my proposal here today is that everyone would be better off if Wall Street and Washington were to sever ties completely. And I think if we were to do this, if we could achieve what, let's agree, is probably a utopia, very quickly we would see bull markets that would make today's bulls seem very limp by comparison. And we'd also see economic growth that would make the growth we've come to get used to in modern times once again seem very limp by comparison. Now, about all this, I'll be up front. This won't bother anyone in the room, but I'm a libertarian of the small L variety. This doesn't make me anti-government as much as it makes me desirous that government do very few things very, very well. I'm also of the view that the federal government should act within the strict constitutional limits set by the founders. Now, this bears relevance to my talk today, given the at least implicit truth that Washington oversees the financial sector, given its belief that doing so leads to a more stable financial system and with it a better economy. We could get into more sinister aspects of it, but I am willing to concede that Washington is doing this, involving itself with finance because it thinks that it's making us and the economy better off. Now, the problem with this idea, the problems with this are twofold. For one, there's nothing in the Constitution that mentions economic growth, and there's nothing that mentions a stable financial system. The founders were wise individuals, and they wrote a very plain, basic document that decreed individual freedom. I think they felt that if individuals were free economically and personally, that they would thrive in ways that you wouldn't need all this other government activity. What needs to be stressed here is that government cannot decree economic growth. It can't create jobs, as so many politicians like to say, but it can decree freedom, and the Constitution allows and really requires it to do just that. Secondly, and this can't be stressed enough, governments have no resources. Now, this is not some ideological assertion. It's not some evidence-free libertarian slogan. It's just fact. Government is only able to act insofar as politicians extract resources created by us and redirect them to things that they deem important. Now, about this, some of the resource allocation may be good. I would probably disagree with that assertion, but that's a discussion for another day. At its core, I think we have to agree, though, that when we allow government to act, we are empowering John Boehner, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid, Janet Yellen, and President Obama to do that which free markets and a free people probably would not do if they were left alone. Now, whether for good or bad is another debate, as mentioned, but to believe that government activity is the source of economic growth or prosperity is to believe that the political types I just mentioned are better at allocating the economy's limited resources than are you, me, Paul Tudor Jones, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, or the broad information-pregnant marketplace itself. Now, thinking about the government's power to distort through activity, it can be said with confidence that Washington's involvement with Wall Street has changed it, and I would say it's very much deformed it. The seen is a fairly prosperous financial sector with lots of high-paid individuals, but the unseen is how much more prosperous it would be, how many more companies it would be taking public, how many more companies it would be merging, how many more financial innovations it would be achieving to get people credit who need it, absent government keeping such a close eye on its doings and regulating it in the way that it does. Government's tight relationship once again weakens Wall Street, and in doing so weakens the economy, and that once again gives government a big black eye. Now, I'm going to say something here that's probably going to bother some in the room, but my view is that people who work on Wall Street aren't paid nearly enough. I find it horrifying that they're not paid a great deal more. And I think if we got government out of the business of finance, very quickly we'd see these individuals who are already paid well being compensated a lot more. And with it, you'd see much greater economic growth. But I think the trade-off for much higher pay is that failure should become the norm. Dynamic industries are marked by constant failure, and the problem on Wall Street today is that failures are being taken on by taxpayers. The trade-off should be higher pay, but when your company can no longer operate, it can no longer attract financing for its operations, it should be allowed to be swallowed. No more bailouts. Now, some might ask why I would want Wall Street to be prosperous, and I do because I would say that Main Street's health very much depends on it. They're one and the same, or identical sides of the same coin. I love Wall Street precisely because I love Main Street. The latter can't flourish as readily if the former is struggling. Main Street creates the credit that Wall Street allocates, and it does so very often effectively. More to the point, Main Street creates the very companies that Wall Street takes public so that they can expand on the way to more production that improves our lives, that makes us healthier, and very often employs us. Thanks to skilled Wall Street financiers, we're able to order the world's plenty, all with a click of a mouse. We can watch news and sports all day, every day if we desire. And if it's raining, we can have a car show up at our door willing to take us anywhere, all by tapping our phone. So to be very clear, I agree with Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein's assertion that Goldman and other Wall Street firms do God's work, as it were. I think they certainly do, as evidenced by all the life-enhancing companies they've taken public, from Dell Computer to Microsoft to Amazon. The list is long. Now, are investment bankers paid very well? Well, they most certainly are, and with good reason. There are lots of good ideas out there, but as any entrepreneur can tell you, it's one thing to come up with an idea, and it's quite another thing to figure out a way to find financing to turn that idea into something real. Investment bankers are paid well precisely because they have a unique skill whereby they know how to find financing for a lot of great ideas and a lot of bad ideas too, which I'll get to in a bit. But it should be stressed that Wall Street doesn't just deserve our praise because of the exciting and dynamic companies that it takes public. It also deserves our praise for what happens in the private equity industry that's very much a part of Wall Street. Now, we all got to know private equity very well back in 2012 when Mitt Romney ran for president. And when you look back to the Republican primaries and the debates, and then in the debates against President Obama, Democrats and Republicans alike bashed, vilified Romney for having gotten really rich in the private equity industry. They said that he made his money based on bankrupting companies and putting people out of work. Let me be clear, I don't think Romney was a good candidate for president. I would argue, and I think I could make a strong case, that his economic ideas vis-a-vis China were exponentially more dangerous for the economy than anything Obama's ever proposed. But I think he erred mightily in this one instance. If I had been his economic advisor, if I'd been his advisor, I would have had him get up on stage in those debates and look at the audience and say, let me explain to you how I got rich. I got rich by finding the sickest companies possible, the ones on their proverbial deathbed, and nursed them back to health. Now, were jobs lost when I did that? Of course they were. We are talking about companies that were on the verge of death. But thanks to nursing them back to health, they were much healthier on the way to much more job creation and the perpetuation of that which was about to die. I would have then had him look to his opponents and say, let's talk about how you made your money. How'd you make it, President Obama? I think if he had done that, he would have had a much better presidential campaign. But the broad point here is that private equity is very much, once again, about Wall Street. Any bank or investment bank has a private equity arm. If they don't, they find financing for these institutions that get rich by virtue of nursing the sickest companies on earth back to health. I think that's a pretty beautiful thing. Now, what needs to be stressed is that Wall Street isn't just about getting financing to the most dynamic of companies and also the sickest ones. It's also great for what it does for all of us as individuals. It's thanks to financial innovations on Wall Street that more and more Americans have access to credit that allows them to buy a house, allows them to buy a car, to finance college education for their children. Quite specifically, thanks to financial engineering, we're able to borrow against future productivity in the present, and this is a pretty big deal. Now, the popular and logical response to all this is that, yeah, all that financial engineering caused a financial crisis back in 2008. Those guys have gotten too creative, but that's a gross oversimplification of what occurred, and it's in fact incorrect. What caused the financial crisis back in 2008, as I'll soon explain, was Washington's close relationship with Wall Street. Financial engineering or innovation had nothing to do with it. But for now, it needs to be stressed that far from some bullying monolithic concept whereby Wall Street believes Y or Wall Street is shoving this idea or these companies down our throats, what needs to be stressed is arguably the greatest thing that Wall Street does for the broad economy is that it's a price giver. Wall Street is a neutral observer that brings together people with differing views on the way to essential price information that powers the economy forward. I cannot express my bullish views of the economy or America's future unless I am able to be brought together with someone who has an entirely different view of the marketplace. And that's what Wall Street does. One of the best ways to think about it is to look back to the internet boom that largely began in the mid-90s. It's so popular in the media today to knock that and say, oh, it was just a big bubble and those fat cats on Wall Street took a lot of companies public that they didn't believe in that eventually failed, widows and orphans, all that. But in fact, it was something quite a bit different. What Wall Street did back then in getting financing to all these companies utterly transformed the world we live in. I defy anyone in this room to tell me that they'd prefer to live in 1994 America versus 2014 America. You cannot compare it. Now, did a lot of those companies taken public fail? Of course they did. That's the sign of a dynamic, healthy economy. Let's go back 100 years to the U.S. in the early part of the 20th century. There were over 2,000 car makers in the United States. Just about every one of them failed. But would we call that a bubble or something bad, something sinister that occurred, an excess of credit that led to a lot of bad companies? No, we would say that, we'd call that a life-changing experience that we would never want to go back to the before of that. It changed our lives. Well, the internet is no different. Thanks to Wall Street finance, we got a huge information surge that has profoundly changed how we live, how we work, how we transact, everything. Now, the beauty of this also is, once again, Wall Street is a price giver. It brings together people with different views. Essentially, it creates the markets that are voting booths for commerce. And so in 2001, a lot of those companies taken public did fail. Again, a sign of a healthy economy. But it was thanks to Wall Street bringing different points of view together that we saw price signals that told us, okay, maybe we've overinvested in certain areas. It's time to regroup and think about what's next. We're better off for it. Now, moving to 2008, Wall Street did another great thing for the economy, and we saw it through the great investments made by John Paulson, the now legendary hedge fund manager. John Paulson made his billions by virtue of his skepticism about the mortgage market. Now, what needs to be stressed here is that Paulson could not have expressed his skepticism absent Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Deutsche Bank finding investors with a polar opposite view of the marketplace. Paulson's trade was a function of being brought together with mortgage bulls who thought that Paulson was nuts. In fact, that's what they said about him. This guy is crazy. Now, people will say that Paulson's billions were the result of pushing people out of their homes or people being foreclosed on. But in fact, Paulson's billions saved the economy from much, much worse. Imagine what would have happened if Paulson did not make the billions that he did based on his skepticism in the marketplace. Those billions were a very pure market signal that too much capital and credit had been invested in the housing market. And thanks to Paulson having made that money, we saved a lot more capital from having been destroyed. Now, the popular point of view about all this is that John Paulson, in fact, his billions were the precursor to the financial crisis. That's not true, and that's probably a good segue to get into what the financial crisis was all about. And let's be clear that it had nothing to do with capitalism and everything to do with the government's close relationship with the banking sector. Now, what I think most people can agree on when it comes to the financial crisis is this, that housing had something to do with it. But from there, the misinformation starts, and it does in a very big way. First off, and contrary to what you hear from economists and pundits, housing is not a driver of economic growth. Housing is consumption. When you buy a house, your purchase of it is not going to make you more productive. It's not going to open up foreign markets. It's not going to lead to cancer cures that elongate lives. It's not going to lead to software innovations that make us more efficient. Housing is consumption. And so when it started to boom in the 2000s, this was a very negative economic signal that the productive growth parts of the economy, the capital-intensive ones, were experiencing capital deficits so that housing could be consumed en masse. And so the question then becomes, why was there this rush into housing? Well, it's popular on the left to say that banks were deregulated. And with these banks suddenly lacking that awesome adult supervision created by regulators, they made a lot of bad loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. Well, the obvious problem with such an assertion is that banks were never deregulated. The banking sector remains the most regulated one in the U.S. and probably anywhere in the world. Think the Fed, the SEC, the Office of Thrift and Supervision, the Comptroller of the Currency, state examiners. Nothing could be more regulated. Furthermore, it's got to be remembered that it was the regulators themselves actively encouraging the banks and rewarding the banks for making loans that made no sense. So the deregulation argument is just absurd. It's popular on the right to blame Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve. People will say that he cut the Fed funds rate to 1% in 2003. This made credit easy on the way to people buying lots of housing with easy credit. Well, the obvious problem with that is something that we could just see looking around us in the city we're in. We're in Fairfax today. Well, imagine if the mayor of Fairfax decided today that apartment rents are too high. And because they are, I decree going forward that the highest landlords can charge is $500 a month. Well, logic dictates that there'd be huge demand for apartments. A lot of people hate their roommates or don't want to live with their parents. There'd be lots of demand for apartments, but no supply. No one's going to offer up something at such a below market rate. Well, credit is no different. Credit is not money. Credit is just access to the economy's resources. Think cars, trucks, tractors, computers, labor. And when government decrees credit artificially cheap, if anything, it creates scarcity, not abundance of it. Furthermore, the interest rate argument ignores basic U.S. economic history. What's too often forgotten is that housing boomed in the 1970s. And it did so in much the same way that it did in the 2000, and it did so with interest rates from the Fed skyrocketing. Let me read you a quote from George Gilder's 1981 book, Wealth and Poverty, in which he described the Jimmy Carter housing boom, this boom having taken place amid skyrocketing interest rates from the Fed. Gilder wrote, "What happened was that citizens speculated on their homes. Not only did their houses tend to rise in value about 20% faster than the price index, but with their small equity exposure, they could gain higher percentage returns than all but the most phenomenally lucky of shareholders." Gilder was writing this about the Carter housing boom amid skyrocketing rates, but I think if I had said to everyone that he'd written this in 2006, no one would have batted an eye. So the rate argument doesn't make sense from a U.S. economic perspective, at least in terms of history, and it also makes no sense considering what was going on around the world. The housing boom was global, and it was occurring in countries that had much higher interest rates than what our central bank was trying to set in the United States. It's also popular on the right to blame Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the mortgage interest deduction, the Community Reinvestment Act. Let me be clear, I want to abolish all of those yesterday. I can't think of anything more anti-freedom and more anti-growth than a government subsidizing the consumption of housing. But to say that they caused the housing boom ignores the fact that housing soared in Canada, a country where it's very difficult to attain a home loan. It soared in England, where they got rid of the mortgage interest deduction back in the 1980s. And it soared in countries where they don't have a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. What caused the slow growth rush into housing was the Bush Treasury's decision early on in the administration to seek a cheaper dollar, a devalued dollar. Presidents always get the dollars they want, and with the Bush Treasury very clear that it wanted the dollar to weaken, the markets complied as they always do. And so with the dollar in free fall, what happened was perfectly normal. Von Mises described this as a flight to the real. When money is losing value, there's a flight into hard assets least vulnerable to the devaluation. And the beauty of housing is it's an asset you can live in when your currency is being cheapened. It's the ultimate middle-class hedge. And the reason that the housing boom was global was pretty basic. When we devalue in the United States, it's always and everywhere a worldwide event. And the reason for that's basic. About 55 countries in the world have explicit pegs through their currencies to the dollar, but realistically, every country in the world to this day is on the dollar standard. At the very least, they have an implicit peg to our currency. And with the dollar in free fall, there is a massive run on currencies of all shapes and sizes around the world, and that led to a global and slow growth rush into housing. So it's popular at this point to say, okay, well, you know, when housing really stopped rising in value, the correction was kind of in the future, but when housing stopped rising, that caused a financial crisis. That's one of the popular narratives. But that makes no economic sense. Housing is once again consumption. All the purchase of housing was keeping capital from reaching new entrepreneurial ideas. So the idea that a reversal of that was going to somehow cause a financial crisis is not a credible assumption. Some will say that it was the troubles within the banks and investment banks that caused a financial crisis. Well, that too just makes no sense. We are talking about the financial system. Nothing could be healthier for that financial system than for its banks and investment banks to fail with regularity and have trouble with regularity. That is perfectly normal. It could never have caused a financial crisis. What caused the financial crisis was the government's close relationship with finance. Specifically, what caused it was that the Bush administration and the Bernanke Fed decided against all rationality to bail out Bear Stearns. If there's no Bear Stearns bailout, there is quite simply no financial crisis. And the reason it created what we call a financial crisis was that it created the assumption in the marketplace that all financial institutions were too big to fail. Lots of people like to point to Lehman Brothers and they say, oh, no, it was when Lehman failed and actually went bankrupt that there was a financial crisis. That is just completely absurd. The idea that Lehman Brothers could shake global markets in the way it did makes no sense at all. It never could on a normal day. The only reason Lehman Brothers shook the markets in the way it did was that the markets had come to expect, based on the Bush and Bernanke ineptitude, that Lehman was going to be saved. That was the policy that they telegraphed. It was a wrong-headed one, but they telegraphed a bailout. And so when it didn't happen, when the Bush administration and Bernanke Fed kept changing their policies on a daily basis, they created a market panic. But if you don't save Bear Stearns in the first place, Lehman Brothers almost definitely goes under the following week, but it's a very orderly and healthy decline, bankruptcy, that is free of all the crisis that came about as a result of it. This was created by government ineptitude, not by capitalism. And it has everything to do, once again, with this close relationship with government, between finance and government. At this point, the Bush administration decided that it was going to pour gasoline on the proverbial fire. There was already a big forest fire thanks to the Lehman debacle, and so the Bush administration decided that it was going to ban short sellers on 900 different financial stocks. Again, we're talking about a close relationship between finance and government. The CEOs of these companies went to government and got the Bush administration to intervene in the markets to keep them out of it. Well, if you want to create a massive forest fire, if it's a smaller one, the quickest way to do it is to rob the markets of very important information. Short sellers are beautiful. They are providing necessary information, some skepticism about the prices of companies. But with them banned from the marketplace, no one could trust any prices of financial companies because they lacked an essential input. Even worse than that, it's got to be remembered that short sellers are ultimately buyers. When short sellers work their magic and bring pricing honesty to the marketplace, what they do is something very special. In doing that, they are creating a massive reserve of buying power. Because how does a short seller ultimately take profits? He re-enters the marketplace and buys back the shares he sold short. To put it very plainly, short sellers put a floor into the market, but when we needed them most, a Bush administration way too close to finance banned them and made the crisis even worse. And then I would argue the biggest but least sung driver of the financial crisis was the basic economic theme that prevailed in the 30 years leading up to 2008. Let's face it, we didn't get the utopia we're all looking for of perfectly free markets, but I think we can all agree here today that free markets won, and they won in a big way leading up to 2008. But in 2008, investors had to price in a very bleak future, and they did precisely because of those bailouts. Bailouts are not free. When you take money from government, you are no longer in the business of profit. Instead, you are serving political masters who don't care about profits, but who want to have a role in how you're running your company, whom you're going to hire, how much you pay them, what kind of business lines you can get into, how much profit you can take, how much capital you'll have on your books, all sorts of things. And so investors had a very easy but somewhat dangerous decision to make. They remembered when government had a far more muscular role in the economy, and they remembered what a disaster it was. And so they had a choice back in 2008, and they necessarily panicked and thought, this is not going to end well. With governments around the world backstopping banks and other businesses, those governments aren't going to leave. And with them involved, that's going to be a much slower, much more sclerotic economy going forward. Now, the argument made in favor of the bailouts was the Ben Bernanke one. He made the most famous argument, and he said this in a quote for the ages to Nancy Pelosi: "I spent my career as an academic studying Great Depressions. I can tell you from history that if we don't act in a big way, you can expect another Great Depression, and this time it is going to be far, far worse." Now let's think about what Bernanke said, and let's think about something we're all familiar with: Japan in the aftermath of World War II, or Germany in the aftermath of World War II. Both countries were literally destroyed. Germans were living in caves. They'd had all of their industry destroyed. Japan had been hit by 2 nuclear bombs, and its other major cities were reduced to rubble. Each country lost at least a generation or two of its best and brightest to a needless war. But within a few years of the war's end, both countries were doing well again. They were both among the richest countries in the world within a few years of the end of the war. And so I asked the question, if Japan and Germany can come back from the total death and destruction of World War II, is it remotely credible, as Ben Bernanke suggested so confidently, that the U.S. couldn't come back from the failure of financial institutions like Citibank, Citi, a bank that's been bailed out 5 times in the last 24 years by the Federal Reserve? I think the very nature of my question answers it. Not only was Bernanke wrong, but you could argue that he was criminally wrong in what he did back in 2008 alongside the Bush administration. Was there a financial crisis? There was nothing financial about this. This was a government-driven crisis that is a function of finance's close relation with the federal government. And when you think about the economy today, it's hard to separate what took place back then from the relatively limp growth we're experiencing right now. If you remove failure from the economy, you by definition remove success. Silicon Valley is not the richest locale in the U.S. and possibly the world because all of its businesses succeed. It's the richest precisely because the vast majority of its startups fail. There aren't a lot of bailouts of Silicon Valley companies, and that's much better for all concerned. Look at Detroit. It was the Silicon Valley before there was Silicon Valley. What made it the richest, one of the richest regions and cities in the United States, and if not the world? It was the constant failure of the car companies on the way to perfection. Failure is a healthy sign of a capitalist system because it means you are starving your bad companies so that you can get funding to your good ones. Would we be much better off today going back over 100 years if we propped up the buggy whip manufacturers at the expense of car companies? Obviously not. Think about Silicon Valley in the more modern sense. Would it be better off had the government bailed out Webvan, the Globe.com, Friendster, Commodore computers? Obviously not. It would be much weaker. Well, finance is no different. When we saved banks and investment banks from their mistakes, we robbed that industry from a much more prosperous future. So the bailouts weaken Wall Street on their face simply because we now have these businesses that are essentially working for profit unfocused and governments who don't care about profits in the first place. Think back to the quote that opened this one up. Your number one client is now the government. That's what describes finance today. But it's also set the financial industry back in a major way simply because if you don't have failure, you don't have the positive evolution that makes you much more skillful at what you do. So when you think about this vis-a-vis Washington, it's a pretty easy thing to analyze, I would say. Washington's bailout of the banks, for one, discredited it in the eyes of the electorate because we have a sense of fairness about us. We don't like to see one sector favored over another. Why should the corner store fail if you're going to prop up the bank? Well, you shouldn't. You shouldn't prop up either. But it secondly discredited Washington because, once again, if your financial sector is not firing on all cylinders, if its number one client is the government, that means its number one client is not the businesses of the future that need financing so that you can turn an idea into something special that employs people. With finance weakened, and it's very much been weakened by government's oversight, by the bailouts, by government trying to regulate it out of into submission in modern times, you will not have a growing economy. So finance is discredited in the eyes of the electorate, but then so is the government itself because the electorate wants more than anything economic growth. Now, what about the Fed? It's a good question. It could be the topic of another talk altogether. But what needs to be stressed for today is that the Fed does not, nor can it, create credit. Credit is what we create in the real economy. It's once again cars, trucks, tractors, computers, labor. So when the Fed presumes to make credit easy, it does no such thing. All the Fed does when it plays around with interest rates is reallocate credit. And to presume at that point that the Fed is a driver of economic prosperity is to believe that Janet Yellen knows better where the economy's limited resources should go than you, me, Paul Tudor Jones, John Paulson, Warren Buffett. The list is long once again. Now the Fed can also, with credit taken from us, bail out banks. But as history very clearly shows, you don't want the bailouts. The bailouts are what rob industries of their positive evolution. The Fed is not helping the banking system when it bails it out. It is severely weakening it. Think once again how much worse off Silicon Valley would be today if Commodore computers were still in operation thanks to a government bailout. We need to let the cities of the world go under. Everyone will be much better off. So ultimately, Washington and Wall Street must part ways simply because the relationship between them is mutually abusive. It's toxic. Toxic. I can't think of a worse relationship that harms both entities in such a major way. So let's end that which harms both participants. Washington and Wall Street must break up because they are better off living apart. Thank you very much.